that we can create the kind of society where people can be equal, the kind of revolutionary, radical society that Amina was describing and that I was saying was at the fundamental part of Islam. And I think that's the only way that we can create a society where both men and women can fulfill their entire potential.
Thank you, Sister Shelina, for your excellent presentation and for your words of wisdom, which I will take on board. I will now like to open the floor for any questions and answers. So we'll start our question and answer session part of this evening. So we have a question at the back.
Thank you for speaking. You mentioned the idea of equality, that Islam's built on this idea of quote-unquote equality between men and women, that we hope to reach a state in society whereby we're equal. Let's just look at that perspective for a second. In the Islamic tradition, Muslim women, for example, by the Western view of equality, and I say quote equality, for example, a man can have 4 wives, a woman can't have 4 husbands, can have 1. A Muslim woman in court, there needs to be 2, 1 man. A Muslim woman has to cover from head to toe effectively, but face to hands, a Muslim man doesn't. And so on and so forth. You mentioned continuous examples. So effectively in the Islamic tradition, it's like this notion of equality doesn't exist. So what would you have to say about that?
So let me just repeat the question in case anyone didn't hear. So he's asking about the concept of inequality and how in Islam we continually try to say how there is equality between men and women, but how would you argue this in the case of examples such as men can have 4 wives and also that the women have to cover from head to toe and cover themselves? So Sister Amina will answer that question.
Brother Sopan, you can turn off the camera now. Okay. Well, I'm not quite sure if you're asking from an Islamic perspective or a Western perspective. Generally speaking, and incidentally, I don't always like to draw that dichotomy, Islamic versus Western. We're all sitting in the West. But people who are against Islam will oftentimes cite that same evidence and say, look how what lower status women have in Islam. These men can take 4 wives, the women can't. You mentioned some legal issues and so forth. So I suppose one could ask, is this a logical conclusion? We have the premise, for example, a woman can't marry 4 men. Does that mean, therefore, the man is the overlord and the woman is the sort of servant on her knees all of the time, kind of at the bottom level of society all the time? Do you get what I'm saying? Do these particular aspects of Sharia, do they point to a broader inequality, saying, woman, you will be, all the way down there, or not? I mean, if we I would say, first of all, particularly if we're in the Shia school of thought, we don't do qiyas at all, and we take things as they are. Whether or not a woman can marry 1 man or 4 men doesn't really have anything to do with her social equity beyond the issue of marriage. Now, the issue of marrying 4 men versus marrying 4 women, I think, mashallah, you've all taken biology class. This is largely a biological issue. If you want to reduce it down for issues of paternity, I think I don't need to explain any more on that. Now, I'm not saying there's other issues involved there too, but I'm saying that's a very basic reason for this. That does not have to do with any sort of, I would say even social inequity or spiritual inequity. It is a gender difference. We have gender differences. I personally think as Muslims we tend to get a little bit overexcited about the idea of separate but equal, or equity not equality. I think sometimes that's just another excuse for institutionalizing equity. However, there are some legitimate differences, childbearing and so forth, which point to that law. But I'm saying there's some very specific issues at hand there that don't point to everything else that's going on in society. Similarly, with regards to the legal issues, one could discuss certain reasonings for certain aspects of the criminal code, but that's not indicative of everything that's going on in society. So I think I don't really want to put, I'm not necessarily going to try to put ideas into your head, so to speak, beyond what I've done tonight, because I know all of you have entered this room with a variety of opinions on the relative position of men and women in Islamic view. I'm sure some of you genuinely believe that men have the higher role position and women have the lesser position. I'm sure some of you also believe it's equal, and some of you maybe think women have the higher position. I don't know. But what I would say is that I think there tends to be a lot of personal opinion in this sort of discussion, and sometimes making leaps of conclusions from things which perhaps don't directly point to that. And I think it is something that should be evaluated in these types of discussions. I mean, maybe not today, but you know, in this generation as a community, to try to come up with some more unbiased and more reasoned conclusions to what the Islamic values really should be. And I think we are doing that, incidentally, in this past decades, and I'm sure we'll continue to do it. And what was the rest of the question? And so I'm saying maybe not to take as many assumptions in, but you know, look at all of these different aspects, whether we're talking about physiological aspects or social aspects. I mean, definitely on a level of human worth and spiritual worth, there's no question of equality. And if you want to get to a deeper question of is Islam patriarchal or not patriarchal, that's a longer discussion that I think we have time for today. But I don't personally see this as a very sort of cut and dry, clear issue. You can turn the camera back on now.
I think she's over.
So should we take the next question at the front down?
You raised a really important point about sort of looking at the questioning Muslim communities. The question that I want to ask is we sort of look at two spheres. We say non-Muslims might be oppressing Muslim women in the sense, in terms of awful media portrayal and things like that. But what about sort of looking into the inner sphere of seeing actually how is the Muslim community treating the woman itself, like sort of saying, if there isn't any cracks in the window, you're not going to get the air coming in. So shouldn't it be that we should be more solid and unified within an ummah itself and sort of iron out the problems that the community is facing and having the courage to discuss it and sort of look into it and see, where can we improve, and then have a solid front to tackle rather than sort of pointing fingers at non-Muslims and saying, you're doing this and you're doing that, when actually we should be sort of, and what's the way forward? Because at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the way things were structured, they had a really good structure in place, the way things were discussed, the way progress was made. Nowadays it seems that it's a lot more lax compared to then, although we aspire to it, and at times it comes across quite pretentious and sort of marketing in a way that we are sort of very religious, but in essence it's not following, it's not sort of. So what do you think would be the sort of in terms of suggestions to improve that?
So what I was trying to lay out in my presentation was the idea that there is a portrayal of Muslim women, and it's I don't really like using this word, but sadly shorthand requires it, from a non-Muslim perspective, and I think we all know what that is. And what I was trying to also portray was that, as you say, in the Muslim community, there are also issues that Muslim women face. And what I wanted to do was at least paint that landscape so that we can start to recognize the different attitudes and find a way to create space. And so my suggestions were that we start talking more openly about it, both the brothers and the sisters, and that women are brave enough to talk about those experiences. But I think